Hello. I'm going to do something a little bit different tonight. I'm going to use more of a soft-speaking ASMR voice. I normally use a softer voice, but it's more like my natural voice, and tonight I'm going to try one that's a little bit higher to see if that potentially triggers you guys in a different way. It actually reminds me of a voice some people would use back in high school in debate to speak really quickly. Use kind of this higher pitched voice. I'll try not to talk too quickly for you guys tonight though. The book that I'm going to read from is called The Leopard by Giuseppe de Lampedusa. It's an Italian book. Actually in Italian the title is Il Gattopardo. It's a bit of a challenging book to read, being both translated, and I think just the style it's written, it's kind of a workout. So hopefully I can do it justice. It actually inspired a movie that's a favorite of mine called The Leopard, starring Burt Lancaster and Ellen DeLong and Claudia Cardinale. It's a really just incredible epic about the end of the aristocracy in Italy, basically in the late 19th century, when Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel were taking over the country. So I'm going to read part of the book to you tonight, and maybe this will be something that we'll keep going with if people like this different kind of voice. Chapter 1, May 1860. Nunc et in hora mortis nostri. Amen. The daily recital of the rosary was over. For half an hour the steady voice of the prince had recalled the glorious and sorrowful mysteries. For half an hour other voices had interwoven a lilting hum from which, now and again, would chime some unlikely word, love, virginity, death. And during that hum the whole aspect of the rococo drawing-room seemed to change. Even the parrots spreading iridescent wings over silken walls appeared abashed. Even the Magdalene, between the two windows, looked penitent, and not just a handsome blonde, lost in some dubious daydream, as she usually was. Now, as the voices fell silent, everything dropped back into its usual state of order or disorder. Bendico, the Great Dane, vexed at having been shut out, came barking through the door by which the servants had left. The women rose slowly to their feet, their oscillating skirts as they withdrew, bearing bit by bit the naked figures of mythology painted all over the milky depths of the tiles. Only an Andromeda remained covered by the soutane of Father Perrone, still deep in extra prayer, and it was some time before she could sight the silvery Perseus swooping down to her aid and her kiss. The divinities frescoed on the ceiling awoke. The troops of Tritons and Dryads, hurtling across from hill and sea amid clouds of cyclamen pink toward a transfigured Conca de Oro. So note, Conca de Oro, literally golden shell, is the name of the hills encircling Palermo. And bent on glorifying the house of Selina, seemed suddenly so overwhelmed with exultation as to discard the most elementary rules of perspective. Meanwhile, the major gods and goddesses, the princes among gods, thunderous Jove and frowning Mars and languid Venus, had already preceded the mob of minor deities and were amiably supporting the blue armorial shield of the leopard. They knew that for the next 23.5 hours they would be lords of the villa once again. On the walls the monkeys went back to pulling faces at the cockatoos. Beneath this pallor meet in Olympus, the mortals of the house of Selina were also dropping speedily from mystic spheres. The girls resettled the folds in their dresses, exchanged blue-eyed glances and snatches of schoolgirl slang. For over a month, ever since the riots of the 4th of April, they had been home for safety's sake from their convent, and regretting the canopied dormitories and collective coziness of the Holy Redeemer. The boys were already scuffling with each other for possession of a medal of San Francesco de Paula. The eldest, the heir, the young Duke Paolo, was afraid to smoke, and afraid of doing so in his parents' presence, was fondling the outside of his pocket in which lurked a braided straw cigar case. His gaunt face was veiled in brooding melancholy. It had been a bad day. Guiscard, his Irish sorrel, had seemed off form, and Fanny had been apparently unable, or unwilling, to send him her usual lilac-tinted billet doux. Of what avail, then, to him was the incarnation of his Saviour? Restless and domineering, the princess dropped her rosary brusquely into her jet-fringed bag, while her fine, crazy eyes glanced around at her slaves of children and her tyrant of a husband, over whom her diminutive body vainly yearned for loving dominion. Meanwhile, he himself, the prince, had risen to his feet. The sudden movement of his huge frame made the floor tremble, and a glint of pride flashed in his light blue eyes at this fleeting confirmation of his lordship over both human beings and their works. Now he was settling the huge scarlet missal on the chair which had been in front of him during his recitation of the rosary, putting back the handkerchief on which he had been kneeling, and a touch of irritation clouded his brow as his eye fell on a tiny coffee stain which had had the presumption since that morning to fleck the vast white expanse of his waistcoat. Not that he was fat, just very large and very strong. In houses inhabited by common mortals, his head would touch the lowest rosette on chandeliers. His fingers could twist a ducat coin as if it were mere paper, and there was a constant coming and going between Villa Selina and a silversmith's for the mending of forks and spoons which, in some fit of controlled rage at table, he had coiled into a hoop. But those fingers could also stroke and handle with the most exquisite delicacy, as his wife Maria Stella knew only too well, and up in his private observatory at the top of the house the gleaming screws, caps, and studs of the telescopes, lenses, and comet finders would answer to his lightest touch. The rays of the westering sun, still high on that May afternoon, lit up the prince's rosy skin and honey-colored hair. These betrayed the German origin of his mother, the Princess Carolina, whose haughtiness had frozen the easygoing court of the Two Sicilies 30 years before. But in his blood also fermented other German strains, particularly disturbing to a Sicilian aristocrat in the year 1860. However attractive his fair skin and hair amid all that olive and black, an authoritarian temperament, a certain rigidity in morals, and a propensity for abstract ideas, these, in the relaxing atmosphere of Palermo society, had changed respectively into capricious arrogance, recurring moral scruples, and contempt for his own relatives and friends, all of whom seemed to him mere driftwood in the languid, meandering stream of Sicilian pragmatism. In a family which for centuries had been incapable even of adding up their own expenditures and subtracting their own debts, he was first and last to have a genuine bent for mathematics. This he had applied to astronomy, and by his work gained a certain official recognition and a great deal of personal pleasure. In his mind now, pride and mathematical analysis were so linked as to give him an illusion that the stars obeyed his calculations too, as in fact they seemed to be doing, and that the two small planets which he had discovered, Selina and Speedy he had called them, after his main estate and a shooting dog he had been particularly fond of, would spread the fame of his family through the empty spaces between Mars and Jupiter, thus transforming the frescoes in the Via from the adulatory to the prophetic. Between the pride and intellectuality of his mother and the sensuality and irresponsibility of his father, poor Prince Fabrizio lived in perpetual discontent under his Jove-like frown, watching the ruin of his own class and his own inheritance without ever making, still less wanting to make, any move toward saving it. That half-hour between rosary and dinner was one of the least irritating moments of his day, and for hours beforehand he would savor its rather uncertain calm. With a wildly excited Bendigo bounding ahead of him, he went down the short flight of steps into the garden. Enclosed between 3 walls in the side of the house, its seclusion gave it the air of a cemetery, accentuated by parallel little mounds bounding the irrigation canals, and looking like the graves of very tall, very thin giants. Plants were growing in thick disorder on the reddish clay, flowers sprouted in all directions, and the myrtle hedges seemed put there to prevent movement rather than guide it. At the end, a statue of Flora speckled with yellow-black lichen exhibited her centuries-old charms with an air of resignation. On each side were benches holding quilted cushions, also of gray marble, and in a corner the gold of an acacia tree introduced a sudden note of gaiety. Every sod seemed to exert a yearning for beauty, soon muted by languor. But the garden, hemmed and almost squashed between these barriers, was exhaling scents that were cloying, fleshy, and slightly putrid, like the aromatic liquids distilled from the relics of certain saints. The carnations superimposed their pungence on the formal fragrance of roses and the oily emanations of magnolias drooping in corners. And somewhere beneath it all was a faint smell of mint mingling with a nursery whiff of acacia and the jammy one of myrtle. From a grove beyond the wall came an erotic waft of an early orange blossom. It was a garden for the blind, a constant offense to the eyes, a pleasure strong if somewhat crude to the nose. The Paul Néron roses, whose cuttings he had himself bought in Paris, had degenerated. First stimulated and then enfeebled by the strong if languid pull of Sicilian earth, burned by apocalyptic Julies, they had changed into things like flesh-colored cabbages, obscene and distilling a dense, almost indecent, scent which no French horticulturist would have dared hope for. The prince put one under his nose and seemed to be sniffing the thigh of a dancer from the opera. Bendico, to whom it was also proffered, drew back in disgust and hurried off in search of healthier sensations amid dead lizards and manure. But the heavy scents of the garden brought on a gloomy train of thought for the prince. It smells all right here now, but a month ago. He remembered the nausea diffused throughout the entire villa by certain Swedish odors before their cause was traced. The corpse of a young soldier of the 5th Regiment of Sharpshooters, who had been wounded in the skirmish with the rebels at San Lorenzo and come up there to die all alone under a lemon tree. They had found him lying face downward in the thick clover, his face covered in blood and vomit, his nails dug into the soil, crawling with ants. A pile of purplish intestines had formed a puddle under his bandolier. Rousseau, the agent, had discovered this object, turned it over, covered its face with his red kerchief, thrust the guts back into the gaping stomach with some twigs, and then covered the wound with the blue flaps of the cloak, spitting continuously with disgust, meanwhile not right on, but very near the body, and all this with meticulous care. Those swine stink even when they're dead. It had been the only epitaph to that derelict death. After other soldiers, looking bemused, had taken the body away, and yes, dragged it along by the shoulders to the cart so that the puppet stuffing fell out again, a de profundis for the soul of the unknown youth was added to the evening rosary. And now that the conscience of the ladies in the house seemed placated, the subject was never mentioned again. The prince went and scratched a little lichen off the feet of the Flora, and then began to stroll up and down. The lowering sun threw an immense shadow of him over the grave-like flower beds. No, the dead man had not been mentioned again, and anyway soldiers presumably become soldiers for exactly that, to die in defense of their king. But the image of that gutted corpse often recurred, as if asking to be given peace in the only possible way the prince could give it, by justifying that last agony on grounds of general necessity. And then around would rise other even less attractive ghosts. Dying for somebody or for something, that was perfectly normal, of course, but the person dying should know, or at least feel sure, that someone knows for whom or for what he is dying. The disfigured face was asking just that, and that was where the haze began. He died for the king, of course, my dear Fabrizio, obviously, would have been the answer of his brother-in-law Malvicia, had the prince asked him, and Malvicia was always the chosen spokesman of most of their friends. For the king, who stands for order, continuity, decency, honor, right. For the king, who is sole defender of the church, sole bulwark against the dispersal of property, the sect's ultimate aim. Note, the sect refers to liberals and Freemasons. Fine words, these, pointing to all that lay dearest and deepest in the prince's heart. But there was something that didn't quite ring true, even so. The king, all right. He knew the king well, or rather the one who had just died. The present one was only a seminarian dressed up as a general, and the old king had really not been worth much. "But you're not reasoning, my dear Fabrizio," Malvicia would reply. "One particular sovereign may not be up to it, yet the idea of a monarchy is still the same." That was true too, but kings who personify an idea should not, cannot, fall below a certain level for generations. If they do, my dear brother-in-law, the idea suffers too. He was sitting on a bench, inertly watching the devastation wrought by Bendigo in the flower beds. Every now and again the dog would turn innocent eyes toward him, as if asking for praise at labor done. 14 carnations broken off, half a hedge torn apart, an irrigation canal blocked. How human! "Good, Bendigo, come here." And the animal hurried up and put its earthy nostrils into his hand, anxious to show that it had forgiven the silly interruption of a fine job of work. Those audiences, all those audiences granted him by King Ferdinand at Caserta, at Capodimonte, at Portici, Naples, anywhere at all. Walking beside the chamberlain on duty, chatting as he guided with a cocked hat under an arm and the latest Neapolitan slang on his lips, they would move through innumerable rooms of superb architecture and revolting decor, just like the Bourbon monarchy itself, plunge into dirty passages and up ill-kept stairs, and finally emerge into an antechamber filled with waiting people, closed faces of police spies, avid faces of petitioners. The chamberlain apologized, pushed through this mob, and led him toward another antechamber reserved for members of the court, a little blue and silver room of the period of Charles III. After a short wait, a lackey tapped at the door, and they were admitted into the august presence. The private study was small and consciously simple. On the white-painted walls hung a portrait of King Francis I, and one with an acid, ill-tempered expression of the reigning queen. Above the mantelpiece was a Madonna by Andrea del Sarto, looking astounded at finding herself in the company of colored lithographs representing obscure Neapolitan saints and sanctuaries. On a side table stood a wax statuette of the child Jesus with a votive light before it, and the modest desk was heaped with papers white, yellow, and blue. The whole administration of the kingdom here attained its final phase, that of the signature by His Majesty D.G. Behind this paper barricade was the king. He was already standing up so as not to be seen getting up. The king with his pallid, heavy face between fairish side whiskers, with his rough cloth military jacket under which burst a purple cataract of falling trousers. He gave a step forward with his right hand out and bent for the hand kiss which he would then refuse. "Well, Selina, blessings on you." His Neapolitan accent was far stronger than the chamberlain's. "I must beg your majesty to excuse me for not wearing court dress. I am only just passing through Naples, but I did not wish to forego paying my respects to your revered person." "Nonsense, Selina, nonsense. You know you're always at home here at Caserta." "At home, of course," he repeated, sitting down behind the desk and waiting a second before motioning to his guest to sit down. "And how are the little girls?" The prince realized that now was the moment to produce a play on words both salacious and edifying. "The little girls, your majesty? At my age and under the sacred bonds of matrimony?" The king's mouth laughed as his hands primly settled the papers before him. "Those I'd never let myself refer to, Selina. I was asking about your little daughters, your little princesses. Concetta, now that dear godchild of ours, she must be getting quite big, isn't she? Almost grown up?" From family he passed to science. "Selina, you're an honor not only to yourself but to the whole kingdom. A fine thing, science, unless it takes to attacking religion." After this, however, the mask of the friend was put aside and its place assumed by that of the severe sovereign. "Tell me, Selina, what do they think of Castelcicala down in Sicily?" Selina had never heard a good word for the Viceroy of Sicily from the Royalists or Liberals, but not wanting to let a friend down, he parried and kept to generalities. "A great gentleman, a true hero, maybe a little old for the fatigues of viceroyalty." The king's face darkened. Selina was refusing to act the spy, so Selina was no use to him. Leaning both hands on his desk, he prepared the dismissal. I've so much work, the whole kingdom rests on these shoulders of mine. Now for a bit of sweetening. Out of the drawer came the friendly mask again. When you pass through Naples next, Selina, come and show your Concetta to the Queen. She's too young to be presented, I know, but there's nothing against our arranging a little dinner for her, is there? Sweets to the sweet, as they say. Well, Selina, bye, and be good. On one occasion, though, the dismissal had not been so amiable. The prince had made his second bow while backing out when the king called after him. Hey, Selina, listen. They tell me you've some old friends in Palermo. That nephew of yours, Falconieri. Why don't you knock some sense into him? But, your majesty, Tancredi thinks of nothing but women and cards. The king lost patience. Take care, Selina, take care. You're responsible, remember. You're his guardian. Tell him to look after that neck of his. You may withdraw. Repassing now through the sumptuously second-rate rooms on his way to sign the Queen's book, he felt suddenly discouraged. That plebeian cordiality had depressed him as much as the police sneers. Lucky those who could interpret such familiarity as friendship, such threats as royal might. He could not. And as he exchanged gossip with the impeccable chamberlain, he was asking himself what was destined to succeed this monarchy, which bore the marks of death upon its face. The Piedmontese, the so-called Galantuomo, note, Victor Emmanuel II of Piedmont, northern Italian province with Turin as its capital. In 1861 he became the first king of the United Kingdom of Italy. The so-called Galantuomo, who was just getting himself so talked of from what little out-of-way capital of his, wouldn't things be just the same, just Torinese instead of Neapolitan dialect? That's all. He had reached the book. He signed, Fabrizio Corbera, Prince of Selina. Or maybe the Republic of Don Peppino Mazzini. No thanks, I'd just be plain Signor Corbera. And the long jog back to Naples did not calm him, nor even the thought of an appointment with Cora Danilo. This being the case, then, what should he do? Just cling to the status quo and avoid leaps in the dark? That would mean more shooting, like that which had resounded a short time before through a squalid square in Palermo. And what use was this shooting anyway? One never achieves anything by going bang, bang, does one, Bendico? Ding, 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 rang the bell for dinner. Bendico rushed ahead with mouth watering in anticipation. Just like a Piedmontese, thought Selina as he moved up the steps. I'll stop there. And if you guys like this, please let me know how you feel about the different reading. I'll keep going with more chapters. Have a wonderful night.